Hello, welcome to SquarePeg Podcast. This is Ari Zagi. Today, I'm talking to Kia Huggan. Kia has a very unique background. She received a Bachelor in Computer Science and Engineering from the University of Connecticut, and now she is a master's student in education from Harvard University. She's a CEO of a startup company, Webquity, and she's been a strong advocate to promote the participation of marginalized population in STEM degrees. I'm very happy to talk to her in this episode of the podcast. Good morning, Kia. Thank you very much for accepting to participate in this podcast, and you took the time. I know you're very busy with the schoolwork, your startup, and taking this chunk of time to talk to me is very valuable. I really appreciate that.
Yes, I'm glad to be here and really grateful for the opportunity. I think the podcast as a whole touches on a lot of important topics and ones that I'm passionate about in particular.
I appreciate that. Yeah, for our listeners to know you better, if you can tell us about your educational journey and your passions for us to know you better a little bit.
Yes, so in terms of my education, I like to start when I was in middle school in Georgia because I was exposed to robotics and STEM education. But in the school district that I was in, my school wasn't the best in terms of we really were textbook heavy. Me and my friend would have textbook races, just like find the word, define it. There wasn't a lot of like projects or hands on learning until my mom bought me my first robotics kit from Radio Shack at the time. And so that science fair experience of building a robot that could find people after natural disasters and seeing how my friends responded to that really sparked my interest to move into high school in Connecticut, which had a much better school system. There were downsides, but academically, it was a better fit in that sense. So, moving into robotics again and really getting into the technical, sort of cool aspects of technology and that being my main interest. And towards the end of my high school career and deciding what I needed to do next, I found interest in making technology that could help people. So I had really delved into the natural disaster angle with robotics, the entertainment option with being on a robotics team. But now I had worked on a braille reader for my friend who is blind and was a germaphobe and didn't like to touch things. And I was like,
Very
I don't like
interesting.
to touch things. And there's sensors that could do that. And I know how to code and we can work on this for you. And so that was my first project that I worked on, like in the accessibility space. But I went on to UConn to study computer science and engineering at the time to continue on that path of wanting to gain more tools to be able to make different technologies and also having that interest in robotics as well as finding different ways to help people. And so my time at UConn, I also fell into education and outreach. I probably spent more time doing outreach than I did studying for my classes during that time and moved on to do my master's in engineering at UConn as well, where I created a startup. I was in the global entrepreneurship program in the engineering school, and I started a startup called Webquity that focused on digital accessibility given the transition that happened in the pandemic. I was working at an educational nonprofit at that time between undergrad and graduate school and saw a real need for accessibility tools for online learning, which we really depended on due to COVID. And so that's what Webquity embodied and started having really great conversations with people who had different disabilities and different diagnoses and then working with them to figure out which tools would be best to develop. So that was my main interest. And then to wrap up the educational journey side, I feel like it's a long one, but I'm currently at Harvard pursuing a master's of education in their learning design, innovation, and technology program. And I chose to move on to education because I felt like I had the engineering skills. So technically I could make anything, but I wanted to make things that I knew that worked. And I had that particular interest in education. So I wanted to study education specifically to have that background to support the types of technology that I wanted to develop.
This is so amazing. This is so amazing. So impressive. And when you were talking, I was thinking about what future holds for you, honestly. With this level of accomplishment and being so young, just more power to you, what you're doing, and particularly because the area you're passionate about, what you want to accomplish, ultimately will help a lot of people. I'm so happy to hear that you have put your energy into this and you're making good progress toward that. There were a few things I want to go back to. Actually, it was very interesting to your first experience with working with a robot. So it happened outside the school, right? Your mom got you that kit and you got hooked after that, right?
Yes, my mom it was themed around the science fair time, and so my mom pretty much decided that my project was going to involve a robot. She had an engineering friend at that time, and I think from her perspective, she knew that engineers were set to make a lot of money, and it was a sort of consistent, reliable career path, and so her perspective was that if you do this, you
Mm.
have a solid career, a solid life, and got me the robot and said, "Figure it out." And I worked with her engineering friend to figure out how to program it and decide what I wanted to do with it. And then being able to demo the light following that it did and object avoidance to my friends. They were all amazed, and our school didn't have anything like that at all.
And all of this outside the school. You did it on your own.
Yes, I built the robot and the project and everything outside of the school and then presented it for the science fair. And I remember my poster, I called it Master Coder, maybe predicting my future. Wouldn't say I'm a master coder now, but at least going in that direction.
Wow. Such a wise thing that your mom did to spark your interest in engineering and innovation. It's a simple thing, although I mean some of these kits could be pretty expensive, but there are affordable microprocessors out there now. I mean like the range of like 50 to 100, $150. And just listening to you, how a simple thing like that really sparked that interest and almost, I can say, changed the course of your life, right? You became more and more interested in this. You spent more time, you built more interest, you gained more insight, and here you are with that. You're talking about accessibility and your company is about that, Webquity. What made you to explore this domain? Any first-hand experience?
Yes, I'd say first starting with the experience of building the Braille reader for my friend in high school, I saw that how technology could help in her specific case and being able to work with on her on that was very exciting. I ended up getting a scholarship for that project as well. So I was like, oh, like other people think this matters too. Like it's
Mhm,
not just me and my friend that find this interesting. And then after graduation, I'd went to work for an educational nonprofit, Black Girls Code, and I was on their curriculum team. And so with developing materials suited to online learning because it was in the height of the pandemic, really making sure that each student had materials that were aligned with their learning styles, their needs that were accessible for them was something that was necessary, but also very time consuming. And so that linked back to my background in engineering, thinking of how I could automate that, how we could customize to each student's needs without having to do this large, like manual work that went into it on the back end.
mhm. So as a creative student, almost I can say a post-traditional student, if that term makes sense. How was your experience with the traditional educational system?
I think that it was very hard for me. Even looking back now, I think even having gone through all of the classes and everything, if I had to do it again, I think I would still struggle just because of the structure that the education system has in terms of engineering being presented as like very time intensive and it's normal to pull all-nighters and be stressed and overwhelmed and having these challenges that are said to build you up into the right person to go in the workforce. But I feel like for me it was just a constant battle of not giving up. Like failing an exam, but knowing that I could like, fostering the growth mindset that I could learn and could get better. But I started to notice that I think the largest struggle for me was that it wasn't becoming worth it anymore. I remember, like, studying for, like, 2 all-nighters for a CSE exam, and I would cry about it, be so stressed about it, and I'd get my test back and, like, receive an A
Mm,
and not feel anything. Like, I would expect to feel excited and, like, I did it, and, like, I put in all this work, but I was like, that was just a lot of
mm,
stress. And so really having to figure out ways for me to cope within that environment, I think are really important. And but it was definitely hard to work within the traditional sense because studying more didn't necessarily mean that I got the better grade. And I think that it's a lot of times phrased as like input to output. If you put in a lot of work, you get a good grade. But I found myself putting in a lot of work and really trying, but not seeing that result. And so really having to look at what would work for me. And I think that's a conversation that's not had a lot. I think the result of that conversation is usually maybe it's just not for you. Like if you if you're putting in work in the way that we say that you should be and you're not doing well, maybe you're just not fit for this. But I think I had to
Mm.
really reflect and figure out ways that it could work for me, which I feel like is a more productive way of going about
Mhm.
that.
So, Kia, in the conversation we had before we start recording, you told me that you think you're neurodiverse, but you never formally sought any diagnosis of any sort. And also, being an innovative Black woman, I think there is so much we can learn from your experiences. So, I want to make sure we take enough time and go through different stages of your educational journey to unpack some of this. Again, like these intersectionalities, they have defined your experiences, and there's so much for us to learn from it and be inspired by it. So do you want to tell us a little bit about your experiences as neurodiverse? I mean, like, why do you suspect that you're neurodiverse? I mean, for our listeners to have a better sense how you feel that way and what makes you think that way.
Yes, I'm trying to think of where to start with that. But I think overall, just in summary, before getting into the details of things, there's been conversations that I've had with friends, with teachers, and all of the sorts that have interacted with me around like possibly having ADHD, possibly having autism as they see me struggle to fit that traditional mold of doing assignments in a certain way, doing things sequentially, doing things within a certain.
Can you tell me a little bit about your struggles specifically?
Yes. I think, like, for example, like, doing things in order is something that I really struggle with. And these are things, like,
Mm,
because I never went to pursue, like, diagnosis or talk about I'm not sure why exactly, but order, for example, like, having to, like, have a to-do list and do the things in order onto the to-do list was something that's, like, really challenging for me, or having a step-by-step process, like, do this, do this, do this. It's something that I would jump around, I'd get distracted, I'd come back to it. Even exams, like, if you give me a multiple choice exam, I'd not comfortable, can't focus going from question 1 to question 30. I'll go, like, 30 to 27 to 2 to 4 because I think it keeps me engaged in that way and sort of makes me feel, like, more
mm.
involved in that process, but to do things sequentially, it's just something that's really hard for me to, like, focus and do. So that's, like, one way, I guess, that I would sort of get around that.
I can relate to that a lot as a person with ADHD. I do the same thing, and you, I think, correctly addressed the underlying reason for that, which is to maintain your interest and engagement. So that's kind of a strategy you use subconsciously to keep yourself interested rather than kind of like getting bored going through the steps as they are dictated to you. So, how was your experience in elementary school years?
I struggled with finding interest in the subjects. Well, I found them interesting. So, like, I really liked school at the time, but I would be very, like, combative with my teachers. Like, if they asked me to do, like, a math worksheet and I already, like, did one that was exactly the same, I'd be like, I already know how to do this. Like, why are you making me do this again? And I'd have, like,
Mm,
I wouldn't want to do, like, repetitive tasks. And I was like, I've shown you that I can do this skill. Like, why are we doing this again? And that sort of thing, and moving, like, off of that, I've also had, like, in 2nd grade, my teachers would tell my parents, like, "She's really creative and really bright, but she, like, doodles on her papers all the time. Doesn't seem like she's really paying attention. It's lots of nice drawings on her worksheets, but we're not sure if
mm.
she's paying too much attention to that." And I feel like from how it was made to seem to me that I was sort of, like, all over the place. But to me, I felt really focused. I was like, "I did that. I'm not gonna do it again. That doesn't really make sense. I'm doodling, but I can hear you clearly. It helps me focus more, even though you don't want me to be doodling." And I think, like, really, I was lucky to have teachers that sort of fostered that. So in the classes where I didn't want to do the work again, they would just give me more challenging work, which is how I got into advanced classes at that young age, for better or for worse in that sense. And then also, like, with my 2nd grade teacher, I remember writing, like, stories that I felt were, like, all over the place, like, from crazy events
Mm.
happening to crazy superheroes. And she would tell my parents that I was very creative and that she sees that within me. And she's like, if she could just focus, it could probably be really great. So that was sort of the experience in elementary school.
What did they want you to focus on?
I think in terms of within the classroom environment, paying attention to the teacher, like, while they're talking, like, not looking down, shouldn't be doodling, sort of, yeah, I just fully, I guess, immersed, like, eye contact, things of that sort.
So a few episodes ago, actually, I talked to Dr. Caitlin O'Brien, highly creative person, and exactly the same habits. actually, I had her in my class, junior year engineering course. And one day I walked down the classroom, and I noticed that she has like this amazing doodle and very strange artworks she had integrated into the book that it was in front of her. And as a teacher, I was looking at her. At that point, I didn't know her well. And I always assumed that she's not paying attention. And when I saw her doodles, and later on, I got to know her and talk to her about that. I realized that's actually, as you said, exactly this. That's the way to keep yourself engaged and interested in the environment and time and the context you are in. So, as opposed to what teachers may think that if you look at them, you're going to listen. Actually, if you look at them, you start daydreaming. By doodling, essentially, you're keeping yourself stimulating and excited on spot. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, it definitely does. And I think with my elementary school experience, I distinctly remember like doodling on the side of my pages, listening to what my teacher was saying, but constantly being scolded to look up, to pay attention, to look forward. And I would always fall back into doodling. I think very similar to what you said. It's just really like a struggle to concentrate on what my teacher is saying. And it's so easy for my mind to go down like 10 different paths. So if I can focus on drawing my doodle at the time, I could also focus on my teacher. And that's something that me and my teacher went back and forth on a lot of times. So it was very hard for me to be able to focus in that type of environment.
Hmm. So you already had developed some strategies and workarounds to maintain your attention, but like it wasn't recognized by the education system because again, they want all the students to sit and look at the board or look at the teacher. How about your middle school years? Anything stands out for you?
I think in my middle school year, there's a time that comes to mind where I think my teacher did embrace my just need for engagement in that way. And it was very specifically my third grade teacher, Mr. G, who's a great educator, and had us writing persuasive essays, like our first time learning about persuasive essays. And I tried my best to like fit into the classroom environment, which is something that I struggled with, but it was very structured. Like you open your essay with this type of sentence, like a question, and then you have like four sentences and just a very formulaic way of doing things. And I remember being incredibly bored. And I was like, I can write it. I did it, but just being really, really disinterested. And I remember even trying to just sort of conform to what my classmates were doing. We were pretty young at that time. So with writing, we were just all like frustrated and they would cry when they were frustrated. And for me, I just felt just really disinterested and disconnected. But I was like, oh, they like cry and like the teacher pays attention to them and helps them. So I was like, I'll cry. Like, I'll try that. I was like, this is what we do when we're frustrated about writing, I guess. And it never really felt right. And so after a couple days of like doing this unit that I found pretty disinteresting, my teacher said, like, think about a commercial, like think about something else. And everyone was still following this template. But I was like, I can write a commercial. Like that'd be really cool to do.
Mm.
And so I went on like a rabbit hole of looking at different commercials. And when it came time to present, sort of did a whole show in a sense. Like I was pitching a product at that time within my third grade class. And my teacher was like, wow, like everyone should do what Kia did. And like really praising me. But I think looking back, that's interesting because most students just followed the template that we were given. And I think
Mm.
that's seen largely in education. Like, why would they do like a commercial type TV pitch when you told us the exact formula you want us to follow? And I only did it because I was just bored enough and wanted to try something new and didn't care to follow that format, but everyone else just sort of fell into it. And back to we were crying, I assume also didn't enjoy it either. So that was one time where my teacher sort of praised me being able to find different
Mm.
ways to engage myself, but I feel like it was still contradictory to the norm that was expected in the classroom.
Why do you think not more educators are doing this, integrating this kind of like out of the box strategies to engage non-traditional students?
I think there feels like there's a formulaic approach to be able to evaluate everyone against one another. And so if everyone writes their essay in the same format and has like different expectations, a rubric essentially to be evaluated against, I feel like the cleanest way to do that is to have everyone conform to your sort of expectations and what you teach them. And so if they align to exactly what you teach them, you can evaluate them pretty simply. But then if one student does a video and one person does a pitch and one does a poem and one does an art piece, how do you evaluate those against each other? And I personally think they don't need
Mm.
to be evaluated against each other. as long as you have an outcome. But I feel like there's very much a standardized approach within education that everyone is expected to demonstrate the same thing in
That's
pretty
that's
much the
that's very
same
true.
way.
I totally agree with you. Essentially, what they are evaluating at the end is the capacity for conformity, nothing else. So they're rewarding
Yeah.
you for your capacity to conform as well as you can. So, and I don't know how that is relevant to innovation and creativity. Honestly, conformity goes against that. And this is one of the philosophical confusions that I have about the education system and how misaligned its approaches are with the needs of our profession. I'm talking about STEM in general, which we're talking about creativity, innovation, entrepreneurship, and all of those things. And yet, what we emphasize on most of the time in our K-12 education and even college is conformity. We expect, I don't know honestly how we expect. This is not related to a certain school state. This is just like I don't know, maybe Department of Education problem or a much higher level issue than individual teachers or classrooms or schools. That we are not asking this critical question: how aligned our educational methods are with the objective we have in mind. If our nation want to be innovative, we have to reward innovation. Innovation goes against conformity. And also there is a big question. I mean, like what is that evaluation about? I mean, what's the point of that? It's not a competition. It's not You're not gonna be first or second, be rewarded for that. It's just like students, they need to achieve their full potential and they need to be encouraged to achieve that. Evaluation, ranking, things like that has no meaning, honestly, in that context. And they are detrimental for students like you also, because you may hang in there, you may use your creativity to survive the system, but it's a missed opportunity if you think about that they could do a lot more with you. They could introduce that robot to you in middle school rather than like waiting till high school. You're the lucky one, actually, that at some point you got introduced to a robot and that changed your life. But there are a lot of other students that may not ever get that opportunity. Their mom may not buy them that robot. And that is the school's responsibility, and they are not delivering that. That's how I see that. I don't know if that resonates with you or not, given that you're getting a master's of education from Harvard.
Yes, I definitely agree. And I think that there are changes on the way. And I'm excited about the rift, at least in my experience, seeing now that ChatGPT and models like it are causing within education. Because if you're able to just type in, like, write an essay about this historical topic, and the algorithm's smart enough to have it not be plagiarized at all, you don't want students to do that. They could do it online. Like, what are you going to value instead of that now, since it's easily like replicated, and it's not going to be about regurgitating information because we have the ability to do that. I think it's going to be about opinion, creativity, your perspective, your unique experiences as it relates to what you're learning. And I feel like the technology is going to force educators down that path, or school will just get a lot easier for students. So either one.
I'm very happy, Kia, that you brought up that ChatGPT actually issue. The reaction of our educational institutions to that has been really puzzling for me, and to a good extent disappointing also. My daughter is in seventh grade, brought up a single page policy sheet from the New York State. Although we are in Connecticut, I think they gave it to them because they want to follow the same policy or something. I don't know where they are with that. But in all caps, they had written that any use of ChatGPT in any form for school setting, I mean, strictly prohibited, as if they are. I was thinking, am I reading about vaping or using drug at the school or something like that? So it was such an interesting thing for me to read. It was surreal that, like, we have in one hand this amazing tool, and the education system, if anything, they have to embrace it and start thinking about teaching students how to harness the power of this new tool that has become available to us. It appeared to me as if they come up with a policy to tell students you are not allowed to, in any form or shape, use calculator, computer, or anything like that. it was very upsetting. I want to get your opinion on that, particularly because you brought that up, and also in the context of conformity. I want to see how you think about that, like how it's going to shake things up.
Yes, I think it's definitely interesting. And I also share your feeling of frustration in some aspects. And with it coming to popularity, at least during my time in education, graduate school, there's definitely been debate around it. And so I feel like seeing that initial fear of, oh, this can write essays, like students are just going to use this, they're not going to put an effort anymore. Like, how will they learn these skills? Versus embracing it as an opportunity for students to have a new tool to use as a thought partner, to get ideas from, to ask questions in a very casual way. Even doing research, I guess, like traditionally, you could say on Google, there's a certain way that you have to phrase your questions and to get to the right information that you want. But on ChatGPT, you can say, like, what about this event? But why did this happen? And it'll respond to you and translate that information, which I think is so much more attainable for students. But I think the initial reaction that I've seen as well is just sort of like, no, you can't use that, which in itself is frustrating. And then even more frustrating on my end when I see research projects and people talking about, oh, how ChatGPT can be helpful for teachers, how it can automate feedback for students,
Mm,
how it can develop lesson plans. And that's really unfair, I feel like, to see it as beneficial tool on the teaching end, but not for the students. And I feel like that is just another large discrepancy that if you can see how valuable it is in your work as an educator, why wouldn't you see value on the student's end and that disconnect around learning for what they should and shouldn't be doing? And also that you brought up the calculator, that's the example that I recently compared it to in a class discussion because it seems like there's this fear that like if you have a calculator, you won't learn how to do math. Like how will students learn to add and subtract and do these things if the calculator is going to do it for them? But I feel like we've seen like now calculators are part of our society pretty heavily. There are math classes that I've taken that say like don't use them at first so that you know how to do a certain operation. But otherwise, we use them as tools, and I feel like we're able to go further because 'cause I'm not doing a triple integral by hand in the same way that ChatGPT can give you a starting basis for essays that you want to write, questions that you want to ask, and really taking opportunity within that. But in the education space, I've definitely seen more of a fear than an embrace. And then in my experience at Harvard within the business school, it's been pretty opposite. They're like, embrace ChatGPT, use it as a tool, get as much information as you can out of it, and being really excited about it. And so seeing that contrast as well, I think is interesting. But overall, really hoping that it turns into a tool for students to use for good, the reasons that I mentioned earlier about being able to speak in their like just casual language and get information and ask questions and really have a thought partner in ChatGPT, I feel like is really important. And then to your point around conformity, I think that's also an interesting question and one of the downfalls that I could see with ChatGPT. Because if you can tell, I'm pretty
yes.
pro ChatGPT and using it, but with conformity, I think there is a concern of whose opinions get portrayed and can an AI model really be unbiased fully? And what does that look like? And if we're completely unbiased, even in that case, are there opinions that arguably shouldn't be shared with students? I can't think of a specific example, but if there's
Yes.
extreme views of things, should those be shared and should those be a part of that education, especially since there isn't an I don't believe there is an age limit or anything about how that type of information is shared. So that could be dangerous as well, and also just personal bias of, like, what information we're seeking for, what perspective we had. Recently, within Black History Month, I was using ChatGPT for casual conversation around the controversial past of Fred Hampton and Martin Luther King Jr., and I thought it was interesting in the questions that I was asking. It's very surface
Mhm.
level, very safe, I felt like, in terms of the government involvement. How were these figures seen during their time, even though they're praised today? And getting answers like, "Oh, these figures challenged the status quo, and so they were very controversial." But then from my perspective, I feel like challenge the status quo isn't enough to describe, like, what these figures were doing, and I feel like that was a very surface level answer for me. So if I was educating a student on that topic, I feel like I'd want it to
Understood.
go more in depth, but to be an objective AI model, like, what does that look like? And just questions around, like, whose opinions and how things will be portrayed is a very important question as well.
And the same way that I understand what your concern is, and I, to a good extent, agree with that, but I also understand that this technology, all of it is at infancy. So we are talking about GPT-3 now. This is trained on a relatively small data set from compared to what we are hearing about GPT-4. These are all rumors. We don't know exactly, but it's 700-800 times larger data set that they are talking about. Again, like these are all rumors. It might be absolutely wrong, but I think it will incrementally improve, particularly with the consideration of the fact that for ChatGPT, they have added that reinforcement learning layer to this. So essentially, with human feedback, they are improving its performance constantly rather than like passive GPT-3 engine, like Da Vinci engine. It has no human feedback on how it performs. So I think there is a lot of hope as a society. Again, like we will co-evolve. This is my view of this. We will evolve together moving forward. It makes information more accessible. Our feedback makes it more refined. But there is always discourse that's needed around some topics. There are always topics that there is no right or wrong. There are two views, then they have their points. So how to deal with those to make sure we are not oppressing the opinion of the other group would be a very interesting ethical question. I have no answer to it. I want to go back to ChatGPT because, again, like that is something that as we speak, there are things going on even at UConn that an article actually came up a day or two ago. I'm trying to get the author of the article. I invited her already to be a guest on the podcast. She wrote an article on ChatGPT is helping individuals with ADHD. A very interesting short article. And I really related to the content of that. Again, as a person with dyslexia and ADHD, that I'm using it to enhance my productivity, lower my anxiety. So I think this is a transformational technology, and we are again at that juncture to make the right decision. Like, for example, you mentioned at your school in Harvard, they are embracing it. Another school in another state, they may ban it and see how it's going to affect the competency of their graduates. As we speak, we are taking actions seemingly innocent that they are feeding to this bias and disparity that we are blaming previous generation for. By doing things like that, we are putting cohorts of students geographically, like all students in this state or that state, at disadvantage because, again, there's a knee-jerk reaction to it, or like whatever it is not a wise reaction. It's not an informed reaction.
Yes, I definitely agree. And I'm hoping that it'll continue to be a tool for innovation and creativity versus sort of shutting students out of having that experience. And if anything else, just being able to be exposed to the technology, interact with it in a facilitated environment like school is important because when they're out of school, it's very much a part of their world, and how they use it then can be sort of the precedent for how that will go
Yes.
can be set within school.
So, Kia, let's go back to your high school. I know you mentioned that the system was traditional. You found your interest outside the school. And I want to see like if there were topics that you enjoyed or you didn't enjoy. If you can also touch on how you brought your creativity to classroom.
For my high school experience, I found it interesting. I think during the school day, so not extracurriculars, I found it to be pretty typical of just doing assignments, doing essays, doing what was assigned of me. Found it really hard to be able to do homework, turn it in on time, like sort of follow that consistent pattern. But within my classes, I don't feel like I expressed creativity too much. I went to an agricultural high school, so we did have wood shop, metal shop, floral design, which are very unique classes that I think are inherently creative since you're able to make your own projects and things like that. So, but I think those are environments where that was the norm. So outside of that in high school, I don't feel like within the classroom I had many opportunities to express creatively. And I didn't go for it in the same way that I did in middle school. Because I think also a part of my high school experience was dealing with heavy bullying, discrimination, racism. And so, with that, my goal is not to stand out. It was to keep my head down and sort of really follow what I was supposed to be doing to blend in as much as possible. So, I think in terms of during the school days, it was definitely not a priority for me. Extracurricular wise in robotics, I sort of had that outlet. And art after school, there was an art garage. We could make projects. I used those as outlets. But during the school day, I
Hmm.
just tried to stick to the traditional structure.
I didn't ask you this question, Kia. Why you never sought any formal diagnosis? You didn't need that, or there were other considerations?
I think culturally was one big factor. So with my parents and their belief on mental health, or arguably like not having a belief on mental health, not really believing that that was a thing at the time, they were very much concerned that if I were to go get diagnosed for like showing symptoms of depression or anxiety, that this would go on some record, I guess, that employers would see, and that that would be another barrier to me getting employment, to me being socially accepted. And as a Black woman, them already being
Mm.
concerned about the barriers that came with that identity and the terrible experiences I was having in high school at the time. So my parents were very much like, "We can talk about it at home and we can help you, and you don't need to go outside of this house because it will things can get very bad very quickly in terms of how I can be perceived and how they could be perceived as parents." So that was a large determining factor. And also, I think academically, because I was in classes that were marked as like higher level, like honors, AP, advanced programs, since I was able to perform academically, I think there was less of a concern. So, like, if I was doing the work and I was getting through the system, if you will, that there wasn't a high concern. Like, it wasn't a concern enough unless it affected me
Mm.
academically.
Wow. I had read about this that students from marginalized populations, the chances of them seeking formal diagnosis or seeking any accommodation is much, much lower because of the fear of the stigma. And here we are speaking about that. It really saddens me to my core. What do you think other Black kids, let's stay with your experience a little bit here. What's your suggestion to their parents now when you look back? Would it have been like really detrimental, or it was just like an idea, a fear that wasn't really that valid?
I think that if I could go back, I would have definitely wished that they would have advocated for me to be seen, to get help, to step past their fears and prioritize my well-being over my future sort of pathway that I could take.
Hmm.
So I wish that's what would have happened. And then to the validity in their concerns, I do think that it's valid. And I think that's where it becomes hard because I think that people who are diagnosed with ADHD and different or autism and things like that have stigmas that come with those diagnoses and how they navigate on top of other intersectional identities, such as being Black and being a woman, and knowing that having that, in a sense, does make the journey harder, but it doesn't change it whether it's diagnosed or not. Being diagnosed and getting help makes it a better pathway, I feel, because if I was to get diagnosed with ADHD, I would still have ADHD whether there was a diagnosis attached or not. So being able to have that help, I think, is the best decision at the end, even though there are very real barriers and disadvantages that and stigmas that can come with being with mental health as a whole.
That's very true. That's a very wise piece of advice. And that's also another reason that we should abandon this deficit narrative to help dissolve that stigma gradually. For some reason, we decided to call these natural variation, neurological variations, disability. And that produced this stigma. And now we are dealing with the consequences of that. Whomever did that the first time, or like people who did, I mean, probably they were as innocent as people who are banning GPT-3 at schools. I mean, like they had no bad intention, but here we are, generations of students, real people like you, paying the price for that, and that is, and like people do things, and it's very important as soon as we realize the damage of a policy, an idea, a narrative we take immediate action to correct that. rather than say like, it has been always like that. I mean, we are not going to fight the whole like medical system or education system to, I mean, like they find a way around this. And then like there are real consequences to real people by being silent. And that's one of the reasons we are doing this podcast, to raise awareness, honestly, around this topic. I mean, by letting you to speak into that rather than papers showing with numbers. I mean, like that the percentage of students from marginalized populations seeking accommodation or help is much lower. This is, again, like those numbers, definitely they don't say the whole story the way you can tell it. And I'm sure there are many, many other students like you that they may benefit from a positive strength-based perspective toward this kind of neurodiversity, the acknowledgement of the natural nature of the variations that we have. But again, like we are not doing meaningful efforts toward that. What is your take on this deficit narrative around neurodiversity?
I think that just immediately and directly knowing that it's false and that people think differently, go about things differently, have different ways of processing information, which can all be valid to whatever desired outcome there is. And I think that within society, there's, say, a student looks like X, talks like X, does this, and same for employees. And then I guess on the other hand, I also struggle with figuring out the balance of with working with students, telling them that the way that they are is fine, which is true, and, like, however they are and who they are is something that should be embraced, and there's nothing wrong with that. But then also knowing that within the world that they're entering, there are barriers and judgment and stigma, and how to prepare them for that. And I guess interested to know your perspective on that as well, because within, like, specifically working with underrepresented students, that's something that comes up. Because I can say, like, "Wear your hair how you want and talk how you want and listen to the music that you want to, as you should be able to. But also, when you go out into the world, there's people that possibly will discriminate against you for that. And you may not advance in your career because of that and have real consequences. And I think similarly towards like ADHD, autism, et cetera, and masking in order
Yes.
to, as a means of survival, not even to conform in order to survive, not because you believe that you're less, but because of how things are structured. Interested in your perspective on how to navigate that sort of this embracing of self versus successfully navigating the society that we're in that way.
That's an amazing question. My answer would have been very different a few years ago if you had asked that question than today. I would have encouraged the students to stay there and fight and advocate for themselves and things like that. I think a little differently. The potential harm and the damage that this resistance, if again, like I'm talking about individuals, may cause to a person, again, like they have to do a risk to benefit analysis. Is it worth staying in that environment and fighting to make things right? Or they have to just move on and get out of that toxic environment? Luckily, these days we have so many options in terms of where we want to live, when we want to go, where we want to go to school, whom we want to hang out with. My suggestion today is get out of toxic relationships and environments. It's very, very difficult to change people's mindset if they're not ready to, if they're not open to listening to you, if they are already looking at you as an adversary. It's very, very difficult to change people's mindset. Again, like more power to those that they stay there, they fight. We have so many examples of them, those revolutionaries. But I think is a safe recommendation that the first course of action should be getting out of that environment and finding a more nurturing, understanding environment. Even at in terms of place of living, it can be true. Luckily, again, like in this day and age, we have less ties. I mean, that probably they give us like more mobility. So I don't know if that makes sense to you or if you want to add to that. That is my suggestion.
Yes, I think that makes sense and also relates to my personal experience of post graduation and particular to the experience of being underrepresented within engineering as a woman and as Black women. Going into workplaces that were safe environments for me was a priority. And so I feel like with the extent that people are able to do that, that's great. And in terms of like just inclusive environments for neurodiversity, having employers that acknowledge that, schools that acknowledge that and support students to do that, being able to filter into those environments. And then also, on the other hand, thinking about the people who don't have an option and who are stuck in that situation or as a means of survival have to be in their circumstances for whatever reason. And then towards what you're saying, to fighting that fight and having allyship,
Yes.
I feel like is very important. And that's something that I wanted to extend in like founding Webquity because I'm not dyslexic and I don't have visual impairments in the sense of the tools that we're developing. But I think that from my experiences of my identities, learning to be an ally, learning to elevate voices, because it's hard to fight and to always be fighting and unfair, in my opinion. And so, anywhere that I can use my skills and be an ally to elevate voices, to develop tools that can help people that aren't myself, I think is important as well. And so, having more of that just community based approach, I feel like, because it can be hard to keep fighting constantly, like
Yeah,
you said.
thank you for doing that. And if a company if an environment they don't see how amazing you are, you don't want to work in that place. They lack some vision at a very, very fundamental level. And I tell that to everyone because of the name of the company, or they know like that the company does cool projects. I mean, that doesn't mean that they have wisdom. And that lack of wisdom appears as, again, like banning GPT-3, or like not understanding the true value of diversity, how it can make them better, how it can enhance their vision. They can see the world more fully, essentially, if employers are more diverse, rather than like all from one segment of society. Companies that they don't get it, they don't get it. And they will pay price for that. Not in terms of like discrimination lawsuit or things like that. They won't be creative enough in this day and age. Only companies that they are diverse, they are including the full spectrum of ways of thinking, life experiences, individual perspectives. Those are the ones that they can compete in the age of an era of ChatGPT, honestly.
And I feel like in my experience within like the entrepreneurship space as well, having diversity, equity, and inclusion be embraced has been a journey for me on Webquity's end. Like I've pitched to boards of judges and gotten questions like, why does this matter to me? Like, okay, you explain that you are prioritizing users with visual dyslexia and visual impairments, but I don't have that. So why would I care? And I like what those questions started coming to me, I just felt angry. And I was like, you're pretty much asking me why you should care about people that
Yeah.
aren't yourself. And it took me a while to understand like how even that question's being phrased, but then really breaking it down to being in an environment that prioritizes profit and more people means more profit. And having to take a step back and look at if that's right for me because not wanting to just focus on profit, focusing on people and having that distinction be made has been really important to me. And I think like what you're saying, prioritizing what's best in terms of the people that you're hiring, the people that you want to be supporting versus just getting to an outcome. Because if you're just getting to an outcome, you don't really need to care about anything about a person's identity or how they think or what they do as long as they
Yes.
get what needs to be done. And I think that's a really harmful way of approaching it. And with Webquity and having those conversations with judges and things like that, it really made me reflect on how I'm going about things and being really careful to help a problem and not exploit a problem. And I feel like a lot of people will exploit a problem, in this case for profit
Mm.
or for their benefit. And so, really wanting to stay away from that as well.
Can you explain that a little bit more? Because that is also a problem. I 100% agree with you. I think you're in a great position as an entrepreneur, as a creative person, as a Black woman who is an engineer, who is creative. Can you explain how you see that problem of exploitation?
Yes, I feel like within the entrepreneurship space, it's always about identifying a problem, developing a solution. And so when you see a problem, you want to be able to help whoever like the target users are, who you're serving, that population. But I feel like rarely is the solution to actually solve the problem. The solution is to come up with something that
Yes.
a solution that people will rely on to mediate that problem. The problem goes away. You don't have a business anymore. And that's dangerous to the entrepreneur if that's your main priority. And so exploiting that problem, like in my case, if I were to approach it, like I know that the people have these diagnoses and therefore they need these tools that they're not getting. So I'll charge them for these tools because that's the only way that they'll be able to succeed better. And so if I put that as a contingency, I put their academic success based on their purchase to me. And I feel like that would be very unfair, especially working
Mm,
within the space of learning preferences and learning styles and different diagnoses is that students should have these tools already. That's the problem in itself is that they don't have these tools to succeed academically. And so that raised the question for me, do I switch to a nonprofit model? Do I stay for profit? And currently, it's changed over time, but currently having the decision to be for profit, but only charging educational institutions who have the responsibility to provide those
mm,
tools to their students and putting the responsibility on them to get the tools for their students and working with them to do so versus having students purchase directly from Webquity in itself and have buying those tools on a subscription or things like that because they're tools that they should have.
mhm. I had that question actually in my list to extensively talk about Webquity, but now that we are talking about that, if you introduce the company a little bit, where you are in terms of the business and your model, things like that.
Yes. So overall, Webquity is a digital accessibility tools company and currently working on the first product called Digital Glasses. And so, Digital Glasses is a web plugin that modifies web pages to a user specific preferences and needs. And so, a student would take an evaluation to evaluate which font size, which tools are most helpful for
Mhm,
them, and which alignment, spacing to increase their reading speed and comprehension that they're able to do their academic work online easier. And then from there, the plugin modifies websites based on the results of that evaluation. So having that individualized approach to accessing their education. And to get to that point has been a lot of customer discovery interviews and like mentioning talking with you as well and getting all of these perspectives of what works best, what doesn't work, what's needed, and that has been on my end just very an enjoyable part of the journey to have those conversations, to learn more, to do the research. And another way that I think I'm varying off of the traditional entrepreneurship path, which I feel like is doing things as fast as possible, getting out to market as quickly as you can, but really taking a pause away from that and wanting to have the understanding of what will actually be impactful. Because the software development side is the least of things. It's really figuring out what will work
mhm.
and who it will work for, how it can work best, and that's been the most enjoyable part of the journey and most time-consuming part of it as well.
Yeah, we had this kind of short conversation before we start recording. I see huge potential. The future education 2.0, if someone asks me to explain it, it's all about personalization. So the previous version of education, which we are still in, we think digital era, digital age is education 2.0. No, it's a different concept. Education 2.0 is all about personalization. We have to move past that idea of one way of lecturing, one way of assessing works for everyone, and move toward understanding the person. I mean, this kind of like, I don't know what you called it, to identify the way students want to interact with the web page. So that is the first step toward personalization. And even one step further, that like, so you're identified like preferences, challenges, and then on top of that, we need to identify strengths. For example, if the student wants art or music, and why not we incorporate that somehow, kind of what you were doing when you were sitting in elementary school classes doodling. By incorporating that into your classroom, you were keeping yourself engaged. Now, I mean, technologies really allow us to do this in an efficient way. These machine learning based recommender systems, I mean, like, see how accurate, for example, YouTube feed is based on like a few interactions that you have with videos. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, like my my YouTube feed is the funniest ever because my son also watches like 4-year-old videos, and I watch philosophical videos, and like so it is confused where it needs to go with it. But I think we are at a stage that we can seriously talk about personalization for the first time with tools like ChatGPT. We can even personalize content. And you're definitely on track. You're into something very, very important and valid. I hope you succeed.
It brings you back to the question that you asked at the beginning in terms of like what's next for me and like what I see myself doing after this. And my immediate answer is taking a break. Like I think that I've been going pretty consistently and doing a lot for a long time. And I think after graduating this May, I want to focus on Webquity because I enjoy that work. I want to hopefully be a toy designer for STEM toy products. That goes back to like my first robotics kit, producing like that.
Mm,
Those are the things that I want to do, and I want to take a break and not do what's necessarily what I feel is expected of me, what my parents want me to do, which is, like, going into consulting and having 80-hour work weeks because it's very, like, impressive on a resume, but knowing that I can't sustain that. So I think what's next for me is taking a break and doing what I'm passionate about because 'cause I've been working away for a long time without a break.
so is that what your parents want you to do? To probably, I mean, if I want to kind of rephrase it, it's like a sustainable traditional job, right?
Yes, and I've gotten a consulting job offer, and my dad's like, "How could you ever, like, reject that? If I was your age, I would go after that immediately." Sometimes still now, I think has, like, the internal conflict of, like, "Oh, I should do it." But then I feel like there's always going to be a thing. Like, they say, like, "Study engineering and you'll get a job." But then if you get a master's in engineering, you can get an even higher paying job. If you go to Harvard, that's an Ivy League school, and, like, that's great on your resume. And if you do consulting, that guarantees you a career. I feel like there will always be another thing. So I'm just prioritizing what resonates the most with me now as my highest priority.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And having this wisdom this early, again, I am 43. I've started recently thinking about these things. I was just like all about, oh, what's next, what's this, what's the next recognition, what's the next promotion, and a lot of people, when I talk to them, they say, "Oh, you arrived and now you're giving us advice that slow down." It's like, I don't think so. It's more of a age related thing rather than accomplishments related. It's what's becoming more mature revealed to me. I'm trying to be mindful of your time. I know you already have a commitment coming after this. So I have two questions that I wrap up these podcasts with. But before that, if there is anything you want to add.
No, I think I've just really enjoyed this conversation and think it's given me a lot to think about after this and applying it to Webquity and just life in general and how we're navigating society with new technology, with stigma. And I think just, yeah, continuing to have these type of conversations is something that I'll prioritize. Really appreciate it just overall. And as a question for you with this podcast and getting to meet all of these people and hearing all these different perspectives, how has it changed your perspective over time in terms of where you
Wow.
see it going? And is there, well, I guess, like, what impact do you want to continue to have? And how has an impact on you? Because I feel like doing the type of work that we do in terms of awareness and representation, I feel like you also change as a person through this process and make mistakes and learn from them and notice your own like shortcomings. And yeah, just interested to know like your personal impact in terms of what you want
Amazing.
to have and on you.
Sure. I mean, your question had some of the answer in it also. I can tell you that it has changed me as a person going through that experience when we started recording these. When we were done with the first episode, I realized that we are into something. I mean, again, I had ideas about this, how it's going to come out, and like, but after the first episode, when I took a step back and I reflected on the conversation, I was like, that conversation was therapeutic for me. And that gave me assurance that someone else who's listening to this may share some of that experience with me. If I felt empowered through that conversation by just knowing that there are other people, they see the world that way, that means that there are other people that after listening to this conversation may get the same sense of empowerment. That was something that was revealed to me maybe early on when we started recording. And then the feedback I started getting from people. So my target audience initially was like graduate students who are at school. They may feel like that the challenges that they are experiences is because of the label or some deficiencies that like as again like defined by the medical field, or particularly if they have formal diagnosis. So that was my target audience initially. But after we released a few episodes, I started getting feedbacks from high school kids, from school teachers, from university staff. And it was very interesting that most of them were around this kind of like, it helped me end my self blame after I listened to that conversation. I realized that, oh, wow, oh, there are other people out there that they think that way, they feel that way. So it's not me. It's not because I'm, again, like dumb or I'm not putting enough effort. I feel that way. I'm feel anxious. So the feedback I have received has been amazingly interesting. And that has encouraged me to reach out to more guests. And I want to also take this opportunity to invite people to contact us through the email address that we put in the podcast description. If they know someone or if they themselves think that they can contribute to this effort. It's taking a lot of time. And again, for you particularly, because this piece of information might be beneficial to you, this goes against everything that academia rewards. I am supposed to be sitting in my office writing proposals and papers, bringing money, doing things that they consider it productivity in the academic world. Here we are having this lovely conversation, connecting with you and learning from you. This has no meaning in terms of academic productivity or what my job expectations are. Yet every morning I wake up, the first thing that comes to my mind is like, what can we do to improve this podcast? Or reflecting back on the things that I've learned or heard or the feedback, all of those things. So, and for that reason, I want to take this opportunity to ask our audience to share it with people that they think they are going to benefit from it. Because again, like we are expecting this thing to spread organically. So the only way that this can reach, the people that can benefit from it is by each individual sharing it with a few other people. And also liking it, leaving comments, that also gives us encouragement if we are on the right track. So thank you for asking this question and giving me the opportunity. I really appreciate that. So my concluding questions now. If you think about your 12-year, 13-year-old self, Kia, what would be the advice you would give?
I think the advice that I would give is just to know that everything will be okay.
Hmm.
And that the thoughts that I guess, like, you're speaking to myself, that you're having about not being enough or needing to be fixed or needing to conform are thoughts that are that are a product of the society that you're in and not from yourself, and that there's nothing inherently wrong with how you think or how you do things. And so with that, being able to have the perspective that you're going to go farther than what you think currently.
Hmm.
And I just like knowing now, like, you'll do things that you didn't imagine that you'd ever be doing.
Hmm.
So,
Wow,
just sticking with that.
that is amazing. How about college year self? What would be the advice for Kia when she was an undergraduate student?
I think the most important thing that I would need to hear is that struggling or having hardship isn't a reflection of your ability.
Hmm.
To struggle and to have hardship is a sign of challenging yourself, a potential to grow. It isn't a sign that you can't do those things. It's a sign that you are doing those
Hmm.
things. And so really being able to take pride in that versus feeling shame about it.
Wow, amazing. I really wish you the best. And I don't think you need my wish, honestly, based on this conversation. I have all the reason. I've interacted with many, many students, individual colleagues, professionals at many different levels. You have all the things, all the ingredients needed to have a fulfilling, productive, impactful life. The passion, your first-hand experiences, your intelligence, your amazing intelligence. You have it all. Good luck to you, and thank you again for taking the time to speak with me today.
No, thank you so much. And I just wanted to add, I feel like throughout this conversation, I spoke a lot about how the views of my parents sort of limited me going to get mental health help or really prioritizing profitable careers and money as the predominant, just like priority for security in their eyes. But last week, my mom called me out of, which is very surprising. My mom is a tough parent, like as tough as you can imagine,
Mhm.
tough parent, called me and told me that seeing me at Harvard studying education, she sees that I'm doing what I want to do, that she sees me passionate about my purpose, and that she's happy that I found something that I want to wake up and do every day. And she said she'd noticed this for a long time that I didn't have that, and she's very happy to see me doing that. Which is something that I thought I'd never hear. I thought she was telling me, like, "Why aren't you accepting the consulting job again?" But I think that she sees the worth in being genuine to yourself and having that experience, and if my mom can see that over everything else that she's told me, I think there's a lot of hope there and really resonates with following the path that's right for you. Yeah, so thank you so much for
That's
having me.
amazing. Thank you for sharing that with us. That was key.